Well, let me read something to you. This is from the book Happiness, Joy, and Bliss. It says, joy makes us natural and childlike. And this is why Christ said, until you become like one of them, you cannot enter the kingdom of God. We are so artificial and cosmetically built up. We always act in hypocrisy without manifesting exactly what we are. Joy causes us to express exactly what we are. Imagine being wrapped in a dark cloud. This surrounds us, but a burst of joy can clean this. Try to demonstrate these bursts at your home regularly. Close the windows and start doing it. Joyful people are smart and clear in their consciousness. Those people who consciously and deliberately hurt others and enjoy their pain and suffering are very unhappy people. If you see their life, you will see that they were very unhappy. And then there's just one statement. See if I can find it here. Yeah, here it is. He says, we started from the angelic kingdom. Does that sound lovely? It sounds so lovely. And then he says, then we descended and became nasty people. So I just thought this was a wonderful exercise to experience for all of us. During our 30th anniversary weekend, I talked about groups and group consciousness, and in fact the DVD is now ready if you're interested in seeing that. We also played a DVD of Torgum in which he talked about the Tibetan and groups. So I thought I'd just add to that conversation, that discussion this morning, by talking about psychic energy in groups. Now, this is information taken from a book called Commentary on Psychic Energy. And it is, it takes some thinking to really understand groups as it's being explained in this book. If you're not part of a group, if you've not had experiences in participating in spiritual groups, particularly well-established spiritual groups, then this will just be information, that you might be able to use later on. But if you are part of a spiritual group, a well-established spiritual group, then you'll see the importance of all that we have studied on the principles of unity and what happens when an individual creates disunity and how disunity affects the psychic energy of the group and of each individual that makes up the consciousness of the group. So this is not a feel-good lecture, but it's informative, and I really hope you enjoy it. I have read this particular chapter over and over and over and over again, so I'm very well acquainted with it. On the other hand, as so typical of esoteric teachings, when you engage in a second reading or a 10th reading, you see a deeper layer. And we see those deeper layers if our consciousness has expanded, if our experience has increased in such a way that our consciousness has broadened, and then we go back into a chapter like this and, aha, that's what that meant. So, let me begin. The chapter begins by saying that every group has a subjective network of psychic energy. Every group has a subjective network of psychic energy. So that's the first thing to think about. You want to ask yourself, how does this work? What is meant by subjective? How do we know this to be so? You have to immerse yourself into the whole concept. It is like when you're a musician and you play in a symphony orchestra that's made of 108 musicians. When you're at home during the week, you're by yourself, but you're practicing the symphonies. You're practicing your part versus the drum part, versus the cello part, versus the piccolo part. You're practicing your own part, so you become very self-involved as you are trying to perfect your performance. Then you take your individuality and you move it into that whole symphony orchestra of 108 people. Then what are you going to do? You take your perfection and you blend it, you fuse it into the whole of that symphony orchestra, which is a synthesis of musicians who are playing music by the master. Now, I was thinking when I was in high school, we had this ordinary little kid that played the violin, and he was little, he was short, and he was obnoxious. But he was the individual. He had never learned how to take himself and put it into, that whole symphony of musicians. So he would come in every afternoon when we would have our orchestra class, and he would play his fiddle, literally like a country time, fiddler. And he was good, he was really good. But it was obnoxious because this is not what classical music was about, which is what the orchestra was about, was learning how to play classical music. So he was disruptive. And of course, being kids in high school that imitate everything around them, then they began to, some of the other members began to imitate. And so imagine the conductor when he comes into that afternoon class with that little fiddler playing and some of the other ones playing too, strange behavior. He had to bring them all together. And sometimes he could do it and sometimes he could not do it. So if we can understand the subjective network that was going on, with these kids playing their music and that ornery little kid, how it would disrupt the whole environment of that afternoon of orchestra class. Think about a spiritual group that's substantial, that has grounded themselves in and on a particular path. And then imagine a kid coming in as a fiddler and playing country music as we're supposed to be playing classical music. It's very disruptive, right? Okay, so that disruption disrupts the psychic energy, which is the spiritual energy, which is the flow of life that we want to use to create beauty and color and sound and affect all of us positively on a physical, emotional, mental, and spiritual level. Okay, that's one idea. The next concept is to understand this network, this concept of a subjective network. A group network is not created immediately upon the gathering of people, nor does it occur when group members begin to work and relate together. Now that may be a surprise to you. Or even when they are admitted into group membership. Okay, so this is, first of all, this concept, a group network is not created immediately upon the gathering of the people, nor when they begin to work together, nor when they are taken into membership. So these are three concepts now that, we must begin to understand. And then we have to ask our question, well, then how is a group network created? Have you thought about this? Anybody?
When we start meditating together?
Well, I think so. I think group meditation, like having this exercise this morning on joy, we're all focused on these questions of joy. Now our answers are going to be different, but our focus is on the subject of how to increase our joy, right? And then as individuals, according to our need and our level of consciousness, we would approach that sense of how to increase joy, based on, who we are, where we are, what we are, and so forth. So, but we are all polarized in thinking about joy. Then it's the next step when we then begin to create that subjective network, and that is that we actually do the work together. It takes a long time to build a group network of psychic energy, but this is how we do it. They are built by the substance of mutual love. So if we're developing, like we were trying to this morning, joy and love go hand in hand. Respect. When you see, you may see the personality, nature of an individual that, is irritating to you, but when you see that individual working hard on themselves, or when you see them going through a crisis, or you see that individual experiencing difficulties and problems in their life, and they are stepping up to the plate. They're working through those problems with joy and love. What do? You have respect. This is how we begin to build the subjective network. Also, we begin to build that subjective psychic energy network with thoughts of sacrificial service. Thoughts of sacrificial service. What does this mean? By actions intended to lift burdens from one another's shoulders. As such, these relationships go to raise the quality of the group. As you are helping to lift the burden away from or off the shoulders of another person, you see their response or their reaction. It creates a different relationship between the two of you. If you're the recipient of the sacrificial service of that individual, it changes your consciousness, your thinking, your understanding, your belief about that individual, right? As long as it's sincere. Sometimes it's not. Sometimes people try to help you and serve you for personal reasons. What is that reason I'm thinking of? Selfish reasons. Right? For selfish reasons. But typically that's not the case. And if it is, you'll soon find out, because it doesn't feel right. There'll be something, in that heart center that tells you, no, this doesn't feel right. They want something from me. There's an ulterior motive. So then it's not going to work. It won't help build that subjective network. The network connects people in the group to each other. So if you feel disconnected from your group, it's not because of the group, it's because of yourself. You're not yet in communication with, or you've not yet found a way to swim into that energy or that energetic network that the group has created. Am I clear? Okay. Now, the goal. The goal of groups who have created a group network is to provide the hierarchy with a magnetic network. To provide the hierarchy with a magnetic network by which the members of the group can attract subtle impressions from the hierarchy and then cooperate with the plan for humanity on Earth. So do you see the stages? Do you see how this works? Okay. Eventually, the members of such groups come closer and closer until they become like fiery centers in the body of humanity. I mean, this is a tremendous movement. If we can find within all the groups, spiritual groups in the world, if we can find such people that are now stepping in rhythm to this concept of how to create a group network. Because once a well-established and grounded spiritual group is created and they become a magnet, they are going to also then connect with other such groups. And then the idea of the 100th monkey comes along, where then pretty soon you see this rhythm. It's like, let's take the concept of drumming, which would be an interesting idea to think about. That when people come into a group and there is a particular drum rhythm, let's take one of those Indian type of group drums, you know, the soft thing across the top. What is it called? I don't know. Any drummers? No, the skin, pardon? Yeah, like that. And so it's a different sound of a drum. And somebody comes running and charging in, you know, and throws their books down on the floor and sits in the chair. And then they begin to hear the pulse of that drum. Their whole consciousness is going to change the rhythm of their physical, emotional, mental bodies, which changes the cellular structure of their beingness. That's what will happen to humanity when more and more groups come together and build a psychic network to serve the plan of hierarchy. This is why it is the most terrible crime to cause disunity in groups. Okay, so now do you see what that statement is, how important that statement is? The teaching explains that those who sever themselves from the group literally destroy parts of that network and cause great psychic damage to the soul of the group. Buddha pronounced 7 cardinal sins, one of which was to cause disunity in a spiritual group dedicated to the service for humanity. You know, I don't know who's listening on our webinar this morning, so I would like to invite questions. Charles, if you can watch, okay, so if you feel like it, you know, go ahead and ask your questions so that I can answer them as I go along in the next 10 minutes of the talk. I know, I could talk for 4 hours here. It's a special subject for us to to discover and discuss and to experience. Those who fall into such a cardinal sin, what's going to happen to them? They lose their psychic energy. And when a person loses their psychic energy, they lose that rainbow of protection around them. That rainbow of protection is the 7 colors of the different bodies of consciousness, which the solar angel radiates to you and radiates out into your environment. So this is a real cardinal sin. This is why they call it a cardinal sin, when you cause disunity to such a group. I think it works the same way. If you have a family whose family members function really closely and very beautifully like this, if somebody tries to destroy the unity of that marriage or the relationship between the children and the parents, they come in and say, you know, your parents aren't any good. And they may not say that literally, but behave like that. Say, come to me, I'll help you raise you. Come to me, I will give you guidance. See, then that person is coming in, destroying the psychic network of that family and interfering with the music that that family is creating through their relationships. So I do think that this whole idea that I'm talking about this morning is pretty advanced, but I think in reflection and seeing the process of family members and unity and disunity and what causes disunity in a family, that we can relate the two. So I said those who fall into such a cardinal sin lose their psychic energy. Then they become occupied by dark entities. So if you don't believe in the idea of entities, dark entities, well, that's foolish. I know, it is foolish, because then the mind is throwing it out. See, the logical mind is saying, nah, there's nothing like that. But we believe in negative thoughts. So negative thoughts can be nurtured by negative entities. So who cares whether it's negative energy or negative thought? One and the same. You become, when you lose your psychic energy, then you become controlled or occupied by negative thought, let's say, which gradually leads us to physical, moral, and spiritual destruction. Now, with a group of such that, like I've been talking about this morning, what happens when that psychic network is ripped apart is that the group itself will repair the network. This can be done in a fairly short amount of time. Short amount of time can be anywhere from a year to 3 years, as opposed to 50 or 100 years. Now, we are told that a traitor or a slanderer will never again find a chance to relate to the network. But life after life, that person will be repelled by the psychic energy circulating in the group network. Charles?
I have a question. Is creating a friendship a beginning of learning this process?
Yeah, okay, is creating a friendship the beginning of this process? I think so. As long as the friendship is not based on a social level, but is based on solemnity and sincerity and all the things that I was talking about a little bit earlier. The disruption occurs is expectation. If you have expectation of that friend, then it's inevitable that that psychic network is not going to be built. So let me go back to this, what I was just saying, that a trader or a slenderer will never find a chance to relate to the network. But life after life, can things change? It doesn't. Not if it is a well-established subjective psychic network. Because we tend to think of a group in a physical realm. But when we're talking about a group that has built a subjective network, now we're saying this group also functions on the astral plane, on the mental plane, and ultimately on the Buddhic or intuitive plane. So there is an incredible exchange of psychic energy that is being exchanged from all levels of the subjective life. Charles?
2 questions. Number 1, is it a negative energy when one believes they are being sincere? Is it based on expectations that one becomes viewed as negative?
When we think about expectation and sincerity, they're opposite. When I love you, I don't expect you to love me in return. When I take care of your dogs for a week, I don't expect anything in response, in return. I'm doing it because I love you, because I want to help you, because I know that there is a need there. Now, if I take care of your dogs for a week and I expect a whole lot in return, then we're not building love. Okay, you had another question?
Yes, 2 more. When we are not experiencing joy and want to, is imagining or remembering joy helpful in leading us back onto the path of joy and psychic energy?
Can they hear you asking the question, Charles?
No, they can't hear me asking it, I don't think, but they can read the question.
I can't pick it up here, so it needs to be read.
Okay. Basically, the question was, if I can't experience joy, will it help if I go back to a joyful memory and recall it? Absolutely. But again, you must be sincere. Some people can't remember joyful moments. So if you cannot remember a joyful moment, then I suggest you read that book, Joy, Happiness, Bliss, and so on and so forth, or talk with somebody that knows about your childhood. Talk to grandma or grandpa or your godparents and say, I can't remember anything about my childhood. Was I ever joyful? But absolutely, I have certain pinnacles of joy in my life that I always go back to, and each time I do, look, more things, more of the details of that joyful experience are recalled, and you become so immersed into that joyful moment that what happens, if you can see this psychically, is that colors and beauty, beautiful sounds, a whole new rhythm begins to take place in the auric movement of your auric shield, and you become joyful. And there's one other question, and then I need to get on.
Is the consequences of losing psychic energy dependent on one's level of spiritual accountability?
You want to say that again? If I have to repeat this, it's not easy.
Is the consequence of losing psychic energy dependent on one's level of spiritual accountability?
Okay, what happens when we lose psychic energy? I'm paraphrasing. And why do we lose psychic energy? My belief is that every time we lose psychic energy, it's because we are going against the principles of beauty, goodness, righteousness, joy, and freedom. When we begin to think negatively, when we're engaged in a lifestyle that is going to hurt us through our thinking, our addictions, addictive behaviors, addictive habits, anything that drains the energy from us is the process of draining psychic energy. What is the consequence? Well, the consequence is, as you imagine, we begin to deteriorate, we lose our joy, and that's the consequence in itself. This is why we don't have to punish other people, contrary to the prison system, the way it thinks. Life punishes us. Okay, Catherine, you had your hand up, and then we'll go on.
Okay. When a group becomes aware of a slanderer or traitor, and they begin to take steps to isolate that individual from group damage, is that when the network begins to actually heal the awareness?
Well, no. You have to, okay, Catherine is asking when a slanderer or a traitor is actually removed from the group, is that when the healing begins? The healing doesn't begin until you recognize what the damage is that's been done. So that requires an honesty from the members in the group. Depending on the type of group you have, most people don't want to talk negatively about anybody or to say anything that might be damaging about that person. I think I've heard statements like, well, it doesn't affect me. I see what she did or he did to the group, but, I was friends with that person, so it doesn't affect me. Well, if it didn't affect you, then you're not part of the network of that group. See? Because if you have a traitor on board, that traitor on board is there to destroy the group. They have become an instrument of the forces of darkness to try to destroy the work, the service, the sacrifice of the vision that the group members are engaged in and striving to perfect and manifest. So it's not a personal thing. So it takes recognition of what the individual did, and then how do we heal it? And that's a whole different lecture. Now there is an exception. Where I left off with my notes where I said that the traitor or slanderer will never again find a chance to relate to the network, but there is an exception. The ancients, this is from the chapter, the ancients tell us that there will be only one condition that a group will accept a former traitor. He must confess all his transgressions in the presence of the leaders of the group and give proof of his change of consciousness. Then confess again and open all the corners of his heart to the entire assembly. After such an act, a long period of probation is needed to see if the traitor has changed his heart. This is very, very serious, and is such an exception. I know people that have come back into a group after being a traitor. The group, because we're all such loving, accepting individuals, even though we followed the rules of the esoteric tradition, and letting that person gradually come back into the group. What happens is if that individual really from the depths of his being or her being did not transform him or herself, the fire that the group carries, that incredible spirit that the group carries, that psychic energy that the group carries within itself, will eventually reignite the cause that, you know, that or compelled that individual to become a traitor or a slanderer against a group, and then they'll leave again. So this is why, you know, the group must be really mature and take time before they accept that individual back. There must be a long period of probation and to see if that individual has had a complete destruction of ego, vanity, arrogance, touchiness, and selfishness. And I'm so out of time. But I think the questions were really good. And if you want to learn more, go find the chapter in the Commentary on Psychic Energy. Okay. It's kind of an abrupt end, isn't it? Let's see. Well, let me share this from the chapter. In an old monastery, when such people come back, they were given the most humiliating jobs to test their character change. They were even rejected from the main table and main sleeping halls and given separate rooms in order to keep them away from the group members.